Okay, I think I might ruffle some feathers with this one. I gotta get this out of the way. I'm a big Dragon Age fan. I've played every game in the series twice at least, more so in the case of Origins. I think I've played that one at least 3 times. I've spent a lot of time with each game's cast of characters, and I've spent way too much time reading the wiki for it. I also really like BioWare as a studio, and while I'll admit they haven't done much in the last decade, it was primarily Mass Effect Andromeda, which was fine, and Anthem, which was Anthem. I like their style of RPG, and when I couldn't get it, I felt like I was dying of thirst in the desert. And I know you're going, didn't you say that Baldur's Gate 3 was the most BioWare game not made by BioWare? And it is. But there's some things that, from a structure and gameplay side of things, just sort of turned me off of it to the point where I had to put it down and never got back to it. That has more to do with my mounting dislike of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons as a gameplay system than anything Larian's done, but I'm getting off topic. But when the Veilguard was revealed, the initial trailer was not good. But the gameplay reveal after that, and the next day, quelled a lot of my fears. So I decided, okay, I'm just gonna unplug from the internet discourse until the game is in my hands and I can actually play it for myself. When I saw the initial reviews, some channels I watch a lot and writers I read a lot didn't vibe with it. Others I watched and read did, and that's where my I'm playing this for myself stance really validated itself. It was very divisive from the look of it. And that's what this video is going to be for this week. A look at the first 10 to 11 hours of Dragon Age The Veilguard. Alright, enough putting it off. Let's do this. Let's talk narrative and writing first, because I have thoughts, and this is where a lot of the discussion is coming from. The Veilguard takes place roughly 9 years after the Trespasser DLC for Dragon Age Inquisition. Since then, Varric Tethras, everyone's favorite dwarf and in-universe best-selling author, tracks down Solus, everyone's least favorite elf/elven god, to Minrathous, the capital of the Devinter Imperium, to stop him from doing a ritual that will tear down the Veil, the metaphysical barrier that separates the physical world from the Fade, the realm of dreams, spirits, and demons. The ritual is stopped, but not before 2 more powerful and more malevolent gods are released. Now it's up to you, as Rook, an individual from varying backgrounds, to put together a team and stop these elven gods from destroying the world. That's the basic setup, and if you've never played a Dragon Age game before, that was a lot to take in. If you're like me, and you haven't played anything in this series in recent years, this is also probably a lot to take in as well. Veilguard assumes you've at least played Inquisition and the Trespasser DLC, and it shows, but also assumes that you've never played a Dragon Age game before and tries to go the in media res route, and while I'm into that, I know a lot of people aren't. So there's this weird middle ground of context. That opening aside, the game in its early hours does eventually find its groove narratively, which was around the time I stopped playing to write this script. The stuff that was getting set up, and even some of the stuff I saw had me going, okay, this is Dragon Age-ass Dragon Age, and I'm here for it. And this gets me thinking about the tone. I've seen some things about how the tone of the Veilguard doesn't feel dark enough, or how everyone gets along too much, and how the dialogue is corny as fuck, and I just have to ask, where the fuck have you been? BioWare has always been somewhat self-aware. They've been doing this style of writing since Knights of the Old Republic. I'll be the first to admit that the tones of the Dragon Age series can get quite dark at times, but it feels like focusing on only that is doing these games a disservice because they actually can be really funny. Do I have issues? Absolutely. I do think it's a bit weird that Rook is a predetermined personality compared to the relative blank slates of the Warden, Hawk, and Inquisitor, but I'm starting to see why that is in this story. Rook, in my reading of it so far, was chosen specifically because of his upstanding character by Varric, whereas in the Warden's case, Duncan didn't care because it was blight times and they needed all the extra bodies that knew how to fight. Morals be damned. Hawk and their family was just trying to survive, and the Inquisitor was the only person fit for the job of the Inquisitor because they were the only person to survive a reality-tearing explosion. Rook's here just to get a team together and then kick Elven God butt. And you know who else had to get a team together while also doing the occasional poorly timed one-liner? Commander Shepard in Mass Effect 2. I don't see how the writing in the Veilguard is different from any of BioWare's other games, and it's not like they're going to change it because they usually just throw their work out into the world for everyone to see, and after it's done, they just let you come to your own conclusion. They used to do like an epilogue DLC or an expansion like in the old days, and that was it. But at the same time, I can see how the approach to writing can rub people the wrong way because you can't get into in-depth dialogue trees and learn more about characters you talk to, and that sucks. But that's not to say that the Veilguard doesn't get fucked up, because in the early hours, you go to a place called Demetis Crossing, and you discover that the entire town has been blighted. And the Darkspawn are different. They aren't the perfect reconstruction of Tolkien-style orcs that we saw them as in Origins. They look more, and I know this word is played out, visceral and fucked up looking, as if they've been experimented on almost. I like this new direction for the Darkspawn because it fits with what the escaped elven gods, particularly Gillenane, are doing, and that's asserting their power. But what about the team you built to stop them? And I say that I'm glad you asked. You've got Nev Gallus, a mage and private investigator from Tevinter, who's a member of the Shadow Dragons, a resistance group that fucks up Tevinter's slave trade and helps out those who aren't in their upper classes. You've also got Belara Luther, a Dalish mage who's a member of the Veil Jumpers, a group of archaeologist adventurers who are attempting to find and discover more ancient elven artifacts and keep their latent magic from getting too explosive. And most recently, I had the second of our rogues in Lucanus de la Morte, an assassin with the Antivan Crows who's possessed by a demon of spite and uses that to his advantage. He's tall, dark, brooding, and gives off a lot of Antonio Banderas vibes, and as a result has all the makings of the next big internet sexy man. You also got the recurring character Lace Harding, the former lead scout of the Inquisition, at least in my file, becoming a full-on companion. She's also the character I flirted with the most in Inquisition, mostly because the romance options in that game were not my thing, but I romanced Solus for the extra narrative stuff, and I am regretting that decision. But Lace is a full-on romance option now, and so far I've taken every single one of those dang heart options whenever I see them, because she's precious and wonderful, and every single time we talk she just has me going.
No, it's too cute!
I'm sorry about that, it's just that I don't do romance in Dragon Age outside of Deliana and Origins, and the only other dwarves in your parties are Varric and Oghren, who we can't go for. Mainly because Varric already found the love of his life in Bianca, and Oghren is Oghren. Look, no disrespect to the man, but he got into a wrestling match with a roasted nug and lost. Anyways, a lot of the companion writing is like the story. A bit lighter and takes its time to find its groove, but I think it's good. I like it. There was a thing in Belara's second companion quest where she starts opening up about why she's so obsessive as a Veil Jumper and had me going, I understand now, and ow? Looping back to tone, I think a lot of it also has to do with the fact that we're actually in Northern Thedas as opposed to Southern Thedas this time around. With the exception of Dragon Age 2, which was in the Free Marches, we were primarily in Ferelden and Orlais, which is, Southern Thedas. The former is, in the context of the rest of the world, an ignorant rural backwater where superstition and fear runs rampant, and Orlais is the birthplace of the Chantry on top of its own expansionist empire, and the Chantry has a goddamn chokehold on those two places. In the north, we've got the Tevinter Imperium, Antiva, Parvalan, Orlais, and the Anderfels, just to name a few off the top of my head, and they all have radically different approaches to magic. Rivain and Antiva are much more open-minded, Tevinter is a straight-up magocracy, and the Qunari tightly control that shit to the point of being able to develop gunpowder. Northern Thedas is still kinda fucked up, but overall it's a much more chill place around the concept of magic. One last thing is that I really like how Solus is framed as an antagonist right now. Whenever you talk to him in the Fade, it's kind of framed like how Clarice and Hannibal talk to each other when they first meet in Silence of the Lambs. He's a smug dick, and I hate him. I hate this hypocritical, holier-than-thou piece of trash like Kendrick hates Drake. So far, the Veilguard feels like it's got the storytelling approach of Dragon Age 2 mixed with the presentation of Dragon Age Inquisition. And I like those, so I like this. And, like I said earlier, I'm interested in seeing where the story goes. I think I've rambled enough about my takes and impressions on narrative and stuff, so let's just get to the actual video game part of the video game. Okay, that was huge. If I hadn't driven you off by way of me saying that I like the writing and tone of the Veilguard with some caveats, drop a like, and if you want to see more stuff from me, subscribe, because I got videos going up every Saturday at 11 a.m. And come back next week, because I got a video about what is probably my most anticipated game of the season. Alright, enough of the shilling. Back to the chicanery. The gameplay and structure of Dragon Age The Veilguard are going to be the stuff that draws a lot of contention from a lot of older fans. So, to get why this is, I need to do a bit of history. To start off, Dragon Age Origins was originally supposed to be their take on Baldur's Gate 3, but it didn't pan out because they couldn't get their hands on the license due to the development of it running long. It started in 2002, was unveiled to the world in E3 of 2004, and was being worked on until 2009, while also working on Mass Effect and getting purchased by EA in 2007. And this lines up with the development, ramping up of, and release of Dungeons & Dragons 4th Edition, which came out in 2008, and considering a lot of the community backlash at the time, BioWare just went, well, we're just going to make our own homebrew system, and make it a somewhat accessible version of a CRPG on console. And it proved to be a reasonably decent success, and eventually, EA wanted to reach a wider audience, as big corpos often tend to do, which led to Dragon Age 2 being much more action-oriented, and Inquisition a few years later being a mashup of the strategic aspects of Origins and the actiony stuff in 2. What I'm saying is that the development and history of Origins and Dragon Age as a whole is this weird chimeric mishmash of timing, chasing markets, fandom expectations, licensing issues, and a bunch of other shit I can't mention right now because that's all wholly unique to Dragon Age. Hell, The Veilguard was originally going to be a multiplayer live service game, but it got rebooted to have all that stuff ripped out and converted into a traditional BioWare game. Much in the same way that Airship Syndicate converted Wayfinder, the subject of last week's video, from an MMO to an offline ARPG. With all of that context in mind, all I gotta say is that you can definitely see the game The Veilguard was originally supposed to be between the itemization, skill trees, and general combat, but as far as salvage jobs go, this is a pretty decent one. While I do miss a lot of the more strategic aspects of combat from the other games, that's not to say that the combat in The Veilguard is bad, at least for me. It's a straight-up action game, kind of reminiscent of the Norse God of War games, but with a Dragon Age spin, and the feeling of it, as a warrior for most of that time, felt a bit weird for converting things. But after a certain amount of time, it started to click. Any action game that gives me the option to perfect parry fools is always going to sit right with me, and this is a good one. The timing took some getting used to, but I was getting so used to it that I was tanking on like no problem. But I will say that this is the first time I've ever played a Dragon Age game where the two-handed weapons feel disappointing. In this context, they feel slow and cumbersome, especially when you got a lot of shit you need to dodge, so I've largely stuck to sword and board. But the flip side of that is that this is the first time I actually like playing sword and board as a warrior, because before, I could just take the default warrior companion and build them up to be an unkillable wall. It worked when I had Alistair with me in Origins, it worked with Aveline in Dragon Age 2, and it worked with Cassandra in Inquisition. But look at me. I'm the tank now. Which is good, because the rest of the party is there purely for their abilities and power combos. So, you have a fuck ton of powers that let you prime enemies with a status effect that can then be detonated for a massive explosion and a lot of damage. This has been a thing in BioWare games since the warp interactions in Mass Effect 2, and then getting fully fleshed out into its own primer detonator system in Mass Effect 3, and being in BioWare's games since then. I fucking love it, and will continue to love it. I will admit that it makes combat a little too easy, to the point that my self-imposing challenge mode haven't asked will only use them in boss fights. Plus your own abilities are good to use in a pinch on top of that stuff. I do find it weird that the warrior has a lot of flashy spell effects when you aren't magical in the slightest. That's a weird stylistic choice, but to each their own, I guess. But this has me tempted to give the game another run as a mage, as I often tend to do in Dragon Age, because the mage actually looks really cool in this game. There's also ranged attacks on all classes, which makes sense, because rogues use archery and mages yeet magic. What do warriors do? They throw their shields Captain America style, regardless of weapon set. It's ridiculous, and I love it. Overall, combat isn't bad early on, but I can see how it can eventually spiral out of control if enemies get to be too spongy. But that's not a complaint I have, because years of playing Destiny have inoculated me to that shit. You merely adopted the bullet sponges. I was born in it, molded by it. I didn't know proper combat balancing until I was already a man, but by then, I was already used to it. I don't know where that came from. Let's move on. One thing I have to commend the Veilguard on is its visuals. A lot of the characters look distinct, and it goes a long way to giving them some personality. I don't mind a more stylized look because I'm a Warcraft player, and that game similarly handles a lot of heavy themes while also looking like something out of an animated feature. Plus, the environments look incredible. While they are designed to be a direct counter to the locations in Inquisition, which is to say a lot of wide open spaces filled with fetch quests, here, they're a hub area connected with a series of spiraling, interconnected maps. And you could come back to them later for side quests and stuff. They feel a tad sparse, but at the same time, I like knowing that the majority of areas aren't optional like they were in Inquisition. If the first 10 to 11 hours were anything to go by, Dragon Age The Veilguard is shaping up to be a decent game. It so far doesn't feel like a home run, but it's going some places and I'm vibing with it. It gets to a slow start, but it finds its groove, and I absolutely want to stick with this until the end to see how it pans out. Here's to hoping it sticks the landing.